Somerset Cider Brandy is a distillation of cider, which is made from apples grown in the beautiful English county of Somerset. And these apples, in turn, originate from apple trees that were brought west centuries ago from Kazakhstan, travelling along the ancient Silk Road. The cider brandy has been enjoyed recently by King Charles, as well as festival goers over the years at Glastonbury. Julian Temperley, founder of the Somerset Cider Brandy Company, tells MetroWild about the heritage of apples and cider in Somerset, and also the dynasty of cider brandy that he dreams of creating. This is the MetroWild podcast, where we celebrate city life and wild nature. I'm your host, Yang-May Ooi. My guest today is Julian Temperley. Julian is the co-founder of the Somerset Cider Brandy Company with his wife Diana. The company has been making cider and cider brandy at their Burrow Hill farm in Somerset since 1989. In 2011, the Somerset Cider Brandy Company was awarded Protected Geographical Indication, PGI, status by Brussels. They are the only spirit in England to be awarded a PGI. The PGI recognises the exceptional terroir of Somerset's cider apple region, and each bottle can be traced back to its orchard of origin. Julian is credited with being the first to commercialise cider brandy making in the UK in 300 years, and has been recognised for his services to the cider industry by an award from the Bath and West Show. Julian is also an advocate for Somerset and its traditional orchards. Julian Temperley, what prompted you to start the Somerset Cider Brandy Company?
Well, I've been a cider maker for a very long time, and it was always been asked the question by customers, why don't you distill? And the answer was, I didn't want to go to prison, because our laws in England are very hard on illegal distilling. Anyway, about 30 years ago, there was something came up in Hereford that meant that the museum got permission for educational still, and that gave us an opportunity to apply for the same, and which we did. And after many years of argument with the government and the customs, and partly because we were going into Europe at the time, and the customs took the view that they had to be a little bit more relaxed about distilling than they had been in the past, because all of Europe was more relaxed. The opportunity came to apply for distilling permission ourselves.
For our listeners who are not connoisseurs of the different types of spirits, could you tell us the difference between cider and cider brandy?
Well, cider brandy is distilled cider, and rather like whiskey is distilled ale or beer. And we take the spirit out of the cider, and then we mature that for maybe 20 years, and that makes cider brandy. Cider stays at about 6% alcohol, and is a very different creature. Cider is very much part of our world. We have 200 acres of apple orchards, which produce 40 varieties of apples. We blend those apples and we make cider. And what we distill must be the best cider that we can make. And so it still plays a very important part. But we've gained a lot from our sort of relationships in Normandy, where they make Calvados, which is the world's most famous cider brandy. And the image of cider brandy puts our produce at the farm onto smart dinner tables. And for example, our best restaurants in London, the best restaurant in London, has 3 Michelin stars, which is where we need to sell our products. Cider bumbles along at the bottom end of the market, and cider distilling lifts the image up. And that has lifted the image up of all we make. And so it is a huge boost on the cider market, although it's a different market. And We now have a 10 years old and a 20-year-old cider brandy. And with the 20-year-old cider brandy comes a letter from the king to say how much him and the queen enjoyed it for Christmas last year. And that is the area we need to be looking at. Because we come from a world in the cider world where we have a great love of orchards and apple. We grow apples and different varieties are very important. This we share with the people in Normandy that make Calvados, but we are different apples, different language, many, many other things are different, but we share the respect and love of a dream of orchards and apples and having a product which does justice to the agricultural base to which we aspire to.
So MetroWild is about celebrating our relationship with cities and nature. And essentially, it's quite broad. It's about our relationship to landscape and the places where we live. Can you tell us more about the area where you're based, Somerset? And I believe that your family have been in that area since the 1770s. And then I'd love for you to talk about the differences between Somerset and Normandy. But let's start off with the place of Somerset and your family's connection to that area.
Somerset is a very much an agricultural county in England. A lot of the land is very low, although this farm is not very low. And so we have floods. We're famous for our floods. We don't have a sort of aristocracy in Somerset. Presumably it floods too much for the aristocrats. They went and bought land in more civilized parts. So it is a very pretty place, but for farming it is doesn't like big tractors because the land is too soft and it's not conducive to big estates. We are very much proud to live in this county. My family came to this county originally in 1770 and they've been here ever since. My father was brought up in Somerset and the family is buried in the churches around about. And so my daughter, three daughters live nearby and they're bringing up their children in Somerset. And that's the great gift for the children to be brought up in this county. There's no huge industrial projects. The county is largely agricultural. And cider, in some books, they would say that cider is almost a religion in Somerset. And so people will identify this, the world of apples and orchards, cider, as part of their heritage. And they're very protective of their heritage. In the 1600s, books on cider making treated distilling as normal. And in the 1700s, people got a bit rich in Somerset with an agricultural revolution based on wool at that time and sheep. But we are celebrating the orchards and the apple varieties of Somerset, which are effectively unique. And that's very important. The people are well chuffed that we have a spirit. Every other culture has a spirit. Is whiskey in Scotland, they're proud of their whiskey. And in Somerset, they're starting to be proud of their Somerset cider brandy.
So I was quite struck when you said about the land in Somerset being soft because of the floods and so on, and that it can't support heavy tractors, which means that the agricultural had to adapt to not using tractors and a more perhaps what we might call these days artisanal approach to producing food and drink. But before we sort of go back to that, if you could tell us what your views are of or your experience of visiting Normandy and the cider and cider brandy that they make there, Calvados.
We've had an enormous amount of hospitality in Normandy. We're not making Calvados or aiming to make Calvados, but we are aiming to make a respectable cousin of Calvados. And we have one great advantage that as English people in Somerset going to Normandy I'm not sure the French like English people that much, but we have a huge advantage. We don't come from Paris. And the French farmer has a great hate of people with 75 on their car or 78, which means they live in Paris, because they're an arrogant bunch of bastards. And so not coming from Paris is such an advantage that we would share hospitality with them. And we have a lot to share. But we are different apples, different soil, different climates, different language. But what we're looking for in our apples is the same as what the French are looking for. They have a different climate. And so we're not like English wine making out of foreign varieties of grapes. We have 300 varieties of English cider apples, which is our basis. And those that we grow and make cider out of is the reason that we exist. So we are part of the cider world. Sometimes the cider world is not overpleased because we have, if we sent our best cider to the king, and the king in our case was given the bottle by somebody else, but if we gave our king the best cider we could make, he most likely would give it to his gamekeeper. And the gamekeeper most likely can't write a letter, and wouldn't write a letter. He would just drink it. But if the king has got a hold of a bottle of ours, he's told his aide to write a letter. And that is what we have.
So that is quite interesting that, the British, we know very well, has this class system. So actually, in the world of drink, in the world of cider and cider brandy, there does seem to be this class divide. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we have a class divide because we are very much, we still have a French aristocracy, and it is still an important part of our social system. Less so now than it was many years ago, but it is the underlying factor. I mean, around here, we're called a village called Kingsby Episcopi, which is largely Latin, but the next door neighbor village is called Shepton Beecham, which means beautiful field. My daughter lives in a village called Cricket Thomas. I don't know what cricket meant in French, but Malaby, Cricket Malaby. Malaby means bad grass. And a lot of the villages are still labeled in French, and there's very little sign of the French here anymore. But it is very much a part of English society, which goes back to the Norman conquest. And when people in England get rich, they explore their ancestral roots. And if they find something resembling to be French, they're really happy.
That's really interesting because on the MetroWild blog, where I write various features and essays and articles, I did touch on this 1066 and all that, and how the French language came over after the conquest, and that it was the language of the upper classes. And so I equated, that with social climbing, that the people, the sort of higher ups of that time, the Anglo-Saxons who wanted to get in, with William the Conqueror and his crowd, started to speak French. And so we've got words, and this is just touching the very surface of language, that in French, pork is pig. So we now eat pork. We don't eat pig because it's a little bit more refined. So it's really interesting what you're touching on. Can we talk about the history of cider making and the history of apples in the UK? You're quite knowledgeable about that. Could you share some of that knowledge?
Well, we have 300 varieties of recognized cider apples. But the most amazing thing is all apples in Western Europe can trace their origins back to Kazakhstan, which is halfway to China on the Silk Road. They started arriving in Roman and pre-Roman times, and in the form of grafts of apples or the seeds. And all apples in Western Europe, if you check their DNA, show their roots of where they came from. You can trace it all back. The Silk Road was a fact of life. You can find things that came from certainly gems that came from that far away in archaeological digs in Scotland nowadays. And so it was alive, camels walking through Kazakhstan where they have wild apple orchards, forests. And the forests are still there. Most of them were cut down by Stalin to grow wheat for the Russian Empire. But there is still a large apple culture. Some of my colleagues who are very, very romantically related take a very deep romantic interest in orchards and will go to the Kazakhstan on a holiday or something and see the apples. Alma-Ata is the capital of Kazakhstan, and I believe it translates roughly as grandfather of apples. Anyway, it's a great surprise to us that what we always considered as a very much an iconic British fruit can trace its origin back to that far away. But we have in Somerset varieties of apples, which is the name still has the village name in it. And we have an apple in this village, which doesn't actually follow that rule, but it's called Dabinet. Dabinet might well have been a French name from one of the Normans that came in 1066, but the family is died out now. But in 1880, they found an apple with an edge, which has become the most widely planted cider apple. It's not the only apple around, but we have a lot of Dabinets that they need blending. They're very low in acidity, but they've got a lovely fruitiness to them. But they need a sharper apple like a Kingston Black or a Stoke Red to be blended with them to make some better good cider. And that's the skill of the cider maker. I mean, last year was a very, very bad year as far as sunlight is concerned. And so the apples, the Kingston Black is a very sharp apple. And because of the sugar, a lack of sugar, it became a lot more acidic. But you have to blend that with other apples in a smaller way. It's just like winemaking. You have more acidity north of the Loire and less acidity south of the Loire. So they blend the two grapes together. But I mean, last year cider we made by blending Kingston Black with Dabinet needed to have a lot more Dabinet added because the Kingston Black was so acid. But we use for our brandy the minimum of 20 varieties. And that is when we keep the customs authorities police the PGI rules, which is the protected geographical status.
So the 20 varieties are from Somerset?
Yes.
What I love about all this is that when you're drinking something like cider or cider brandy, particularly if it's made in an artisanal way, you are actually tasting history because of the lineage of the apples from the original apples in Kazakhstan on the Silk Road. You're tasting the inheritors of the Silk Road, and you're tasting the land, soil of Somerset, and you're tasting the weather, whether it's been rainy or sunny. And that is all concentrated and distilled, I guess, to use that word, into this wonderful flavor, this drink that you can just pour out and taste. And particularly if it's made locally with the PGI, so it's specifically Somerset Cider Brandy.
Yeah, in England, in the cider world, there's three areas which are described as vintage areas. That's where a terroir, in the French terms, comes to be a very important thing. And all those areas are in Somerset. Terroir is important. And say the cider world, which you described there, is, almost part of our religion, really. People might say that I'm a bit of a pillock, or not, but they would still say the cider world, which we represent, is in a different league, and we are part of the cider world. And we might get respect for cider brandy because it's part of everybody's heritage. It's not just the product that we make, it is the product that the orchards make. We must respect the orchards, respect the traditions, and that's how you do it.
And I visited the Somerset Brandy Cider Company site. And actually, if anybody listening wants to go, you just Google that and it comes up and you can visit. And I see that you have, in addition to the distillery, you have an orchard. Can you tell us about that orchard and how many varieties of apples are in that orchard? And presumably you take those apples as well to put into your drinks.
In the orchard, alongside the bonded warehouse where the spirit is maturing to cider brandy, there's an orchard. It has about 12 varieties of apples. On the farm, we have 40 varieties of apples. And so we can quite clearly say and prove that we have at least 20 varieties in a bottle of cider brandy. And that's, say, important because a lot of sort of industrial cider making places in England might have concentrate from Hungary or China or Chile, and we don't use any of that. Our product has to be seen to be 100% grown in Somerset from Somerset varieties of apples. But Somerset varieties of apples are the best, and that is what we're looking for. And if I'm in Normandy talking to my colleagues there, we would talk about apples and the qualities we're looking for. And their summer is a lot hotter than ours. It's a lot harsher climate. So our apples grow in very luxurious conditions. Unfortunately, this year would seem to be after a wet winter. Things have appeared which shouldn't appear. But we have 25 miles or kilometers south is a sea. 25 miles north is also the sea because the West Country is a peninsula that sticks out into the sea. And that gives us a very mild climate, which is a great joy, especially on a day like this, which is horrible and cold.
And so can you just give us the big picture of the process of making cider and cider brandy using your own apples? So from the moment that you harvest the apples, and I'm assuming that would be in the autumn, what's the process and how long does it take to end up with a bottle of cider and cider brandy?
If we're making cider, the apples will fall off a tree in October or thereabouts. And they would need to stay on the ground for maybe 2 weeks, and then the starch in the apple turns to sugar. You can ferment sugar, but you can't ferment starch. And then we would leave them on the ground so they're properly ripe. We would harvest them, press them, and then they would go into big vats and ferment. We might add yeast or we might not on the whole, but the fermentation takes the best part of 6 months. And then it is racked off from the barrels and either put into long-term storage in other barrels or it is distilled, ready for distilling. And then it will go to distill. And the cider in that stage is about 6% alcohol. In the still, steam rising up through the cider would take the alcohol and the taste components and pass it to another column where it's condensed and comes out as apple eau de vie. Eau de vie basically means water of life, and it comes out at 70% alcohol. Then in 70% alcohol, it goes into barrels, either sherry barrels or new oak barrels from the Allier forests of southern France, or barrels that have served us well in the past. And if it goes into that, then some of the cider brandy will be aging for anything up to 20 years. It's a long wait. We bottle the first, what we produce is 3 years old, then we bottle some at 5 years old, and our main seller is 10 years old. That's a lovely, smooth spirit, which has a place in the restaurant or a place in a private house as a nice after dinner spirit. And it does us a lot of good. We have some which is 20 years old, but the 20-year-old is kept for very special conditions. The next 3 years, we're very short of 20 years old. Then we have enough. Then we have quite a lot. The 20-year-old, when we started, was just a dream. Now it is a dream. It is absolutely brilliant. When I'm doing tastings, I don't think we've ever had a situation that 20-year-old hasn't impressed. There's no question that people say, I prefer this at 3 years old. But it's the same in a way for whiskey. You have old whiskies which taste brilliant, but they still taste of whiskey, which is always a shame. The dream is being able to pick up a lovely glass of 20-year-old brandy and sell it around the world. But for the moment, we don't have enough. We have to keep it for the odd bottle for the king and a few people like that. All spirits have got to go through this problem. And we have the best thing we have is the apple tradition, which is what we credit the whole thing and everything we do. We are the apples of Somerset.
So that is quite something. 20 years, that's a generation, isn't it? If you laid down the bottle at the same time that you had a child, you'd have a 20-year-old ready to head out into life. That is quite something. And I think for me, thinking about our modern life where it's all fast food, fast fashion, fast everything, we grab our sandwiches, everything is all about convenience. So to think of something that takes 20 years to mature and 20 years to actually taste at its, prime, that is quite something, because you have to have faith in the future. You have to lay it down and think, well, 20 years from now, the cellar, the storage place where you've got it's still going to be here. I'm still going to be here, or somebody's still going to be here to take it out and to send it out into the world.
Yes, it is either a very clever thing to have done, or maybe it was very stupid. But we've arrived at a situation for different reasons that we have a 20 years old, which is utterly brilliant. And it is not thought out as carefully as that, but that 20-year-old takes the dream of everybody involved in the cider world. In Hereford recently, they cut down a 300-acre orchard of cider apples. It made national news. It was very sad. And that was very sad. The fact we have a 20-year-old brandy made out of similar cider apples is something for everybody to celebrate. And we have something which carries the dream of everybody. They might not like cider. They might not even like cider brandy, but they are pleased that they're to do. One of my colleagues, the cider maker, he said when he was 85 years old, he said it was pleased that it was us distilling. He wished that he was there himself, but he was by that time 85. And he said the most important thing was that for the cider industry, it has at last happened, because we needed this to lift up the whole image of our products. And ultimately, we're lifting up the respect of the local population and the other population of the orchard culture, growing apples. And when you're harvesting apples in a cold November day, when you started off working in the orchard when it was dark and it was slightly rained with frost on the ground, and you're going to go home when it's dark, you need to lift up the image to think it's going to arrive at something which does justice to 2,000 years of apple tradition. Then you can forget about the Kazakhstan link and say cider apples of Somerset. And this village I live in Kingsbury Episcopi, the cider apples are valued with respect by all the cider makers in the country. Some have never heard of the apples, or heard of the varieties, but they still think it's better. And it's got to be better than apple concentrate from China. We are Somerset apples.
So just to pull back a little bit, as it were, to pull the camera back up into the sky and look down at Somerset, we've got the cider culture there. What other artisanal food and drink produce is there in the Somerset area?
Well, besides apples, which grow on the hills beside the levels which flood, in the levels we are famous for growing widdies, which make willows that make baskets. That has always been the backbone of the countryside. They grow on ground which floods, and so that is what otherwise traditionally dairy farms and willow. Cheeses, I suppose. I mean, Cheddar is a Somerset village and has given its name to a cheese, which is famous throughout the world. Everybody can call it Cheddar now because it's not a protected name. The techniques of making cheddar are very widely accepted throughout the world and actually used. And so it's not but Somerset is still the home of cheddar, and it's home of the dairy industry that provides the milk and turns into cheddar. We now have vineyards which are starting. They produce a nice wine with a lovely nose, northern grapes grown in the cold climate have a nice nose, and that's always something which English wine has. But they don't really have a name for it yet. But it will come in due course.
I really love that sense, again, of landscape working in or people working in collaboration with landscape, because the Somerset levels, which we spoke about at the very beginning, and you talked about flooding, but actually because of the flooding and the wet landscape, willows grow and that's harvested to make baskets or whatever. And again, I'd forgotten, of course, Cheddar is a place. And that is, again, it gives me that sense of connection with the land. The next time I eat cheddar, I shall think of you in Somerset. And vineyards and what you say about, wine growing is probably quite new in the UK in terms of the sort of at a commercial level, and the northern climate affecting the taste of the grapes and therefore of the wine. You were saying before we recorded that you're going off to Glastonbury. Can you tell us about that and your cider bus?
Well, the Somerset Cider Bus has been at Glastonbury for the last 50 years, and we're going again. So we spend the last 2 weeks packing up everything that we need for a week at Glastonbury selling cider. We sell cider. We sell apple cocktails as well, which has become a very big thing now there. And Glastonbury goes a long way. It pays for any big mistakes we've made in the course of the year. It gives us a market. It's a very privileged market of people to go to Glastonbury. But there will be 200,000 people there, and there'll be all sorts of bands. So we take with us 60 staff, and we sell cider in a busy way. But it's something the farmer's always done. And so we do it. Michael Eavis, the organizer, is a great agricultural romantic. He is the farmer foremost. His charities are serious. We are there because we are local cider makers, and the people who come to his farm should be given decent Somerset cider, which they won't find from the industrial sector of the market. So we raise our glass to the Glastonbury.
Why do you think it's important for people to support artisanal produce, and how can they do that?
Well, the first way people can support the product is to buy the product. And in our case, we sell cider and we sell cider brandy. Cider brandy goes out through the internet to anywhere in the country on a next day delivery, and that seems to go very well at the moment. But local things mean that the money goes to local people in our wage bill or whatever, and that's very important. If the cider is made from Chinese apple concentrate, then it goes straight to China. But if we want a beautiful landscape and a beautiful country, which we have, we want to preserve that, it's far better preserving it by buying products from the land than giving the land subsidies. So our orchards they're beautiful. If we can sell the cider, they can be maintained adequately, and people enjoy that. But it's the same really with all local things. If you want a vibrant countryside, the products that it makes have to find a market. And in the cider world, if people come to our part of Somerset, they are more than likely to find themselves going to a cider farm, which is something which I like that idea.
And I would say that it is a wonderful thing to do. And we came down to Somerset for the weekend and stopped by at the Somerset Cider Brandy Company. And I didn't really know what to expect. And you have your wonderful dog lying there in the driveway area, and there's the orchard and all the different buildings with the stills in it, and this wonderful shop. And Laura, your colleague, was there offering us little bits of tastings. And because we were driving, we had to be very careful. And I don't drink. I can't drink because I can't process alcohol. I've got what they call Asian flush in America, where I don't have the enzyme to process alcohol. But I tasted some of it. Oh, this is so delicious. I was so frustrated. We've got a bottle, and every now and then I take a little sip, but I can't take very much, otherwise I'll just fall on the floor with one little teaspoon. But it really is very delicious. So I will put a link to the website on the show notes page. Julian Temperley, do you have any last words for our listeners?
When we started, I was having a meeting with the bank manager in Euro, the local town, and he asked what we were doing. Are you building, anyway, he asked whether we were building a company for takeover, which makes sense to him, or a company to do this or that. Are you building a dynasty? So I said dynasty, and serious conversation ceased. I think after that we talked about the weather. But we were building a dynasty, and I now have a daughter to take over. So I have done my bit, which is to build a dynasty or build a succession. She has a daughter and is about to have a son. And so the succession should carry on. And things like this need a succession within a family. It all works because it has to be a very long-term thing. But what we're distilling this year won't hit the market for 20 years. Well, some of it won't hit the market for 20 years. In which time I most likely will be dead. And an awful lot of people will be dead. But the Cider Brandy Company will carry on, and that's important. And it will carry on with our idea of how it should be run, even though we're somewhere else by then. And that's a lovely thought, that we've done something which has a future. I might not live, but the product Somerset Cider Brandy will. And that's all case up to the public, whether they think cider brandy ought to carry on, they'll carry on buying it.
I was speaking with Julian Temperley of the Somerset Cider Brandy Company. There are credits, photos and links to some of the things we talked about on the show notes page. Go to metrowild.co.uk and search for Somerset Cider Brandy Company or Julian Temperley. The views expressed by my guests are entirely their own and do not necessarily reflect my views. This podcast is part of the larger MetroWild magazine-style blog. Go to metrowild.co.uk to find a whole range of articles celebrating city life and wild nature. Staying with the theme of slow food, you can also listen to my conversation with culinary expert and River Cottage TV presenter Stephen Lamb in episode 9 of the MetroWild podcast. Or you can try out Slow Travel in episode 8, where I talk to Zahura Plummer of Oxfordshire Liverpool Streets about the health and social benefits of not always taking the car. I would love it if you followed the MetroWild podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Audible. It's free. New episodes will then appear in your pod listening app as soon as I release them into the wild. A handy link to find the podcast is podfollow.com/MetroWild. The link to the full MetroWild multimedia magazine again is metrowild.co.uk. You can also like the MetroWild Facebook page at facebook.com/MetroWildUK. MetroWild is also on Instagram and YouTube as @MetroWildUK. I'm Yang-May Ooi. Thank you for listening and see you again soon.